Creo que me disculparán si comienzo esta presentación con una pequeña historia. Solo me tomará unos minutos, son 325 palabras, y les permitirá a ustedes entender mejor lo que hoy vamos a hacer y a mí expresar mi agradecimiento por los que hicieron esto posible. Hace unos meses, el Ian Ramsey Center de la Universidad de Oxford abrió un concurso para otorgar subsidios a grupos interdisciplinares de discusión, cluster groups. El marco estaba dado por su proyecto sobre acción expresión divina, el interés era filosófico y teológico, y los fondos los aportaba la John Templeton Foundation. Se me ocurrió entonces hablar con el doctor Pivetta y formar un grupo fuertemente interdisciplinar, en el cual había médicos, enfermeras, investigadores y humanistas, para discutir cómo es posible que un Dios omnisciente, omnipotente y bueno permita el sufrimiento humano. Nos reunimos unas 10 veces, nos repartimos bibliografías diversas, leímos, estudiamos, aprendimos, pero sobre todo discutimos y discutimos. Creo que el objetivo de la discusión no podría estar mejor cumplido. La conferencia abierta de hoy es el cierre de las actividades del Cluster Group, Dios mediante, solo por este año, que quisiéramos hacer otras cosas el año que viene. Mi agradecimiento ahora a la profesora Eleonore Stump. He de confesar que para mí fue una sorpresa conocer a la profesora Stump, y una grata sorpresa, porque la profesora Stump reúne características excepcionales que juntas resultan muy poco comunes en los filósofos. Ella tiene un profundo conocimiento y respeto por la tradición filosófica y literaria, tradiciones que encuentran en sus obras ecos llenos de vigor y facilidad, pero al mismo tiempo manifiesta un profundo interés por cuestiones científicas y por los problemas de nuestro tiempo. Es una persona de gran capacidad analítica y rigor lógico, pero estos hábitos intelectuales no hacen mella en su profunda sensibilidad para la captación de lo humano. Finalmente, ha sido un placer leerla y escucharla estos días, porque me ha mostrado que la erudición no está reñida con la sencillez y que la profundidad no tiene por qué ser oscura. Muchísimas gracias. Y ahora una presentación, como dice un profesor de la casa, una presentación bonsai de su currículum vitae. Eleonore Stump recibió un BA en lenguas en Grinnell College, donde además consiguió un premio Archibald. Tiene una maestría en estudios bíblicos en Harvard y una maestría y doctorado en filosofía medieval en la Universidad de Cornell. Ha publicado extensamente sobre filosofía medieval, filosofía de la religión y metafísica contemporánea. Sus libros incluyen un importante estudio Aquinas sobre Tomás de Aquino y un amplio tratamiento del problema del mal en su libro Wandering in Darkness. Ha participado como disertante en las prestigiosas conferencias Gifford, Wilde y Stewart. Es expresidenta de la Sociedad de Filósofos Cristianos, de la Asociación Americana de Filosofía Católica y de la Asociación Filosófica Americana División Central. Actualmente es la presidenta de la Asociación de Filósofos de Educación Jesuita. En 1999 fue elegida miembro extranjero de la Academia Finesa de Ciencias y Letras y también es miembro de la Academia Estadounidense de Artes y Ciencias. Agradezco entonces la presencia de Eleonore Stump.
So I am glad to be here. I'm grateful for that kind and generous introduction. I'm very pleased to make new friends here. I'm very interested to see what you are doing here, to learn about your work, which is so impressive, to see all that you can do. And I'm looking forward to discussion with you today in the question and answer session after my paper. The problem of evil is raised by the existence of suffering in the world. Can one hold consistently both that the world has such suffering in it and that it's governed by an omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good God, as all the major monotheisms claim? An affirmative answer to this question has often enough taken the form of a theodicy. A theodicy is an attempt to show that these claims are consistent by providing a morally sufficient reason for God to allow suffering. In the history of the discussions of the problem of evil, a great deal of effort has been expended on proposing and defending, or criticizing and attacking, theodicies, the alleged morally sufficient reasons for God to allow suffering. Now, generally, a proposed morally sufficient reason for God to allow suffering is centered on some benefit which could not be gotten without the suffering and which outweighs the suffering. And that benefit is most often thought of as some valuable thing which is supposed to be essential to human flourishing. The significant use of free will is such an example. Virtuous character is another such example. So, for example, very famously, John Hick, the British philosopher John Hick, has proposed what is called a soul-making theodicy. It says that God is justified in allowing suffering because suffering builds the character of the sufferer. And by building the character of the sufferer, it causes the flourishing of the life of the sufferer. Philosophers and theologians who have attacked such theodicies have focused on the claim about the connection between a benefit of that sort and the suffering. Opponents of the theodicy have argued that the benefit could be gotten without the suffering, for example. Or they have said that the suffering is not a morally acceptable means to that benefit. These attacks on theodicy share with the theodicy itself a certain assumption. They suppose that a person's flourishing would be enough to justify God in allowing suffering if only the suffering and the flourishing were connected in the right way. In this lecture, I'm going to call that assumption into question. I'm going to raise a problem which I am not going to solve, not in this lecture. But it's an important problem to solve because it helps you to see what is deficient in many of the theodicies we have, and by that means it will point us in a better direction for thinking about a good theodicy. I'm going to argue that the suffering of human beings can't be justified only in terms of those things that make for human flourishing. I'm going to argue that even if human flourishing is connected in the right way to the suffering in a person's life, the valuable things essential to flourishing are not by themselves enough to constitute a morally sufficient reason for God to allow suffering. And here's why they're not enough. Because human beings can set their hearts on things which are not necessary to their flourishing. And they suffer when they lose or fail to get the things they set their hearts on. And that suffering also needs to be addressed if we think about the consideration of the problem of evil. So I want to be sure you understand at the beginning that I do think there's a theodicy that works. I've explained what this theodicy is in a really fat book. Today I'm going to tell you just about one part of what I think is necessary for that theodicy, and that will be enough for a lecture. The suffering to which I want to call attention can be thought of in the terms of the psalmist, in what the psalmist calls the desires of the heart. When the psalmist says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart," we all have some idea what He's promising. We know for sure that some abstract theological good that we don't care about much doesn't count as one of the desires of a person's heart. Suffering arises when a person fails to get a desire of her heart, or when she has a desire of her heart and loses it. Now, I don't know how to make the notion of a desire of the heart precise, although clearly we do all have some intuitive grasp of it. But maybe we can say that a person's heart's desire is a particular commitment on her part to something, to a person, to a project, which matters greatly to her, and she doesn't care if it has to do with her flourishing. If she loses what her heart's desire is set on, then other things that she might have wanted lose their ability to attract her, because what she had most centrally wanted is gone. That's why the ordinary good things of life, like food and work, fail to draw a person who's lost the desires of her heart. We say she's heartbroken, and that is why she has no heart for anything else. If things essential to human flourishing are valuable because they're valuable for all human beings, generically valuable, then the things that are the desires of our heart can be thought of as the things that have value for a particular person just because she has her heart set on them. Think about the value a child has for its parents. So Mariano has children, I have children. I care about my children a lot more than I care about his children, I'm sorry to tell you. And that's not because I think my children are more valuable than his children. It's the other way around. My children have infinite value for me because I have my heart set on them. And that's why they are so valuable. So the value the desires of the heart have for a person comes from a person's love of them, not the other way around. So clearly, each of us cares not just about our own flourishing. We also care about those things that are our heart's desires, that have value for us because we set our hearts on them, and we suffer when we lose them. It is important to see that suffering which comes from the loss of a heart's desire is often enough compatible with human flourishing. As far as that goes, for any human being, any particular historical person who is an exemplar of a flourishing life, it's certainly arguable that at some point in that person's life, he will have lost or failed to get something on which he had his heart fixed. Stern-minded thinkers in varying cultures, Stoics, Buddhists, Maoists, and many in the Christian tradition, stern-minded thinkers have been fiercely committed to the view that human flourishing is independent of luck and independent of fortune. On this stern view, human flourishing ought to be understood in a way that makes it perfectly compatible even with poverty, disease, disabilities, the death of loved ones, betrayal by friends, estrangements from family, imprisonment, and so on and so on. But it certainly seems as if any one of those bad things on the list I just gave is enough to break the heart of a person who suffers them. So, for example, in the history of the medieval Christian tradition, human flourishing was taken to be a matter of relationship with God. On that view of flourishing, most of the evils on that list I just gave are compatible with flourishing. That's because a person can be in a relationship with God, feel that she's in a relationship with God, even if she has poverty, disease, disabilities, and any of those other things. So you can have flourishing even if you are heartbroken. That's what the stern-minded have to tell us. And this stern-minded attitude that you can have flourishing no matter what your heartbreak is, this is also common in our own day, in our own culture. A particularly moving example of this attitude is given by a famous writer, John Hull, in his very well-known book about his own blindness. You should all have a copy of the handout. The handout has the quotations and parts of the paper on it. I won't tell you to look at the handout. I'll just assume you can think of that by yourself. But this quotation is on your handout. After many, many pages explaining the great suffering caused him by going blind, John Hull summarizes his attitude toward his blindness in this powerful passage. This is what he says. He's talking about a religious experience that he had in church while he was listening to beautiful music. And this is what he said in the church while the music was coming at him. He said, this thought keeps coming back to me. Could there be a strange way in which blindness is a dark, paradoxical gift? Does it offer a way of life, a purification, an economy? Is it really like a kind of painful purging through a death? If blindness is a gift, it is not one that I would wish on anybody. But in the experience of this music in church, as the whole place and my mind were filled with that wonderful music, I found myself saying, I accept the gift. I accept the gift. I was filled with a profound sense of worship. I felt that I was in the very presence of God, that the giver of the gift had drawn near to me to inspect his handiwork. If I hardly dared approach God, he hardly dared approach me. He had thrown his cloak of darkness around me from a distance. But now he had drawn near to seek a kind of reassurance from me that everything was all right, that he had not misjudged the situation, that he did not have to stay. It's all right, I was saying to God. There's no need to wait. Go on, you can go now. Everything's fine. And here's what I want to say. Everything is fine, in some sense having to do with relationship to God, and so with flourishing, insofar as relationship to God makes flourishing. I have no wish to undermine anything in that moving and powerful passage from the blind man. And yet, something more does need to be said. The problem is that suffering is not confined to things that undermine a person's flourishing and keep a person from being fine, in this deep sense of fine, where you can be fine and going blind. What is bad about the evils human beings suffer is not just that they can undermine a person's flourishing, but also that they can keep her from having the desires of her heart, when the desires of her heart are for something not essential to her flourishing. Suffering also arises from the loss of the desires of the heart, and that suffering has to be addressed as well. For a theodicy, that suffering also has to be justified. So that's my claim. That suffering also has to be justified. But if you state it so bluntly, that claim looks a lot less open to question than it really is in the philosophical world. To see the problem, think about it this way. We do not ordinarily suppose that a parent's goodness is called into question if the parent refuses to give the child anything the child sets its heart on. But as regards the problem of evil, what's at issue is something that looks the same, namely God's allowing some human being not to get the desires of her heart when those desires are fixed on something she doesn't need for flourishing. So you might think to yourself, why should we suppose a good God must provide whatever, not necessary to flourishing, a human person has set her heart on? Now I want to grant it's certainly true that there can be very problematic cases of heart's desires. A person could set his heart on things that were very evil. He could set his heart in random ways on very trivial things, and so on and so on. In those kinds of cases, reasonable people are unlikely to suppose that some explanation is needed for why a good God would fail to give a person the desires of his heart. But even if we rule out cases like that, there remain many cases in which a person sets his heart in humanly understandable ways on something which is not essential to his flourishing and whose value for him stems from his own love of it. Surely in that class of cases, some justification is needed for God's allowing a person to suffer heartbreak. But here's the thing, even that weaker claim, that much weaker claim I just made, will strike some people as false. Some people think that human flourishing is such a great good, an infinite good, a good too great to be measured in connection with other goods, and so because that good is possible, even when other goods are lost or denied, that ought to be enough for us. These people think if God provides flourishing for a human person, that ought to be enough, nothing else is necessary. A person who doesn't think flourishing is enough, who complains about heartbreak anyway, a person like that looks to these objectors, looks like somebody who wins the lottery, but is nonetheless unhappy because she didn't get exactly what she wanted for her birthday present. In the history of Christianity, there have been stern-minded thinkers who would not accept the claim that any loss of a heart's desire that causes suffering needs some justification. This stern-minded attitude is unwilling to assign a positive value to anything which isn't human flourishing. So for that reason, this stern-minded attitude is unwilling to accord any value to the heart's desires, and in fact, it's often enough eager to root out the heart's desires themselves. You can find an attitude of this stern-minded kind in the Christian tradition from the patristic period onward. In its patristic form, you can see it vividly in a story which John Cassian tells about a monk named Pater Modus. Cassian's story about Pater Modus is horrible. At least I really hope you find it horrible. But Cassian tells this story about Pater Modus with great admiration. Cassian thinks it's a terrific story. Here's what Cassian says. Here's Cassian's story. It's on your handout. Pater Modus's constant perseverance in his request to be admitted into the desert monastery finally induced the monks to receive him along with his little son, who was about 8 years old. To test Pater Modus, to see if Pater Modus would be more moved by family affection and love of his own son than by obedience and mortification of Christ, which every monk should prefer to his love, the monks deliberately neglected the child. They dressed him in rags, and they even subjected the child to cuffs and slaps, which the father saw some of them inflict on the innocent child for no reason, so that the father never saw his son without the son's cheeks being marked by the signs of tears. Although the father saw the child being treated like this day after day before his eyes, the father's feelings remained firm and unmoving for the love of Christ. The superior of the monastery decided to test the father's strength of mind still further. One day, when the superior noticed the child weeping, he pretended to be enraged at the child, and he ordered the father to pick up his son and throw him over the wall of the monastery into the Nile River, which would have killed the child. The father, as if the command had been given him by our Lord, at once ran and snatched up his son and carried him in his arms to the riverbank to throw him in. The deed would have been done had not some of the brethren been stationed in advance to watch the riverbank carefully. As the child was thrown, they caught him, and thus they prevented the command, performed as it was by the father's obedience and devotion, They prevented the command from having any effect. That's Cashin's story about Patermudus. Now, Cashin really likes this story. He plainly prizes Patermudus' actions and attitude. But surely we will find this story chilling and reprehensible. For my part, I would say that one can only wonder why the monks bothered to catch that child if the father's willingness to kill the child was so praiseworthy in their eyes. Can it really be morally praiseworthy to will an act whose performance is morally prohibited? An attitude similar to John Cashin's, but less appalling, can be found a millennium later in some texts, but not others, of the work of Teresa of Avila. To take just one example from many I could have picked. Teresa is writing to her sister nuns, and she's evaluating her own spiritual progress. And this is what she says. Oh, how desirable is the union with God's will. Happy the soul that has reached it. Such a soul will live tranquilly in this life and in the next as well. Nothing in earthly events afflicts it unless it finds itself in some danger of losing God. Not sickness, not poverty, not even death. For this soul sees well that the Lord knows what he is doing better than the soul knows what it is desiring. But alas for us, how few there must be who reach union with God's will. I tell you, I am writing this with much pain upon seeing myself so far away from union with God's will, and all through my own fault. Don't think the matter lies in my being so conformed to the will of God that if my father or brother dies, I don't feel it, or that if there are trials or sicknesses, I suffer them happily. So here's what she's saying. Not feeling it when your father dies, not weeping over his death, is in Teresa's view a good spiritual condition, which she is not yet willing to attribute to herself. Teresa is here echoing a tradition which finds its main medieval exemplar in Augustine's Confessions. Augustine says that at the death of his mother, by a powerful effort of will, he kept himself from weeping at her funeral, only to disgrace himself in his own eyes later by weeping a lot in private. In this same text from which I just quoted, Teresa emphasizes the importance of love of neighbor. But it's hard to see how love of neighbor goes with that stern-minded attitude manifested by Teresa in the face of the imagined death of her father. It is the nature of love to desire the good of the beloved, to desire union with the beloved. But the desire for the good of the beloved is frustrated if the beloved gets sick and dies. Or, if the stern-minded attitude is unwilling to concede that point, then this much is certainly true even on the stern-minded attitude. The desire for union with the beloved is frustrated when the beloved person dies, because then the beloved person is gone and absent. So one way or another, the desires of love are frustrated when the beloved dies. Consequently, there is something bad and something lamentable, something worth weeping over, something whose loss brings affliction with it, about the death of any person whom one loves, one's father, or even one's neighbor, whom one is bound to love too, as Teresa says. Unmoved tranquility at the death of another person is incompatible with love of that person. To the extent to which one loves another person, one cannot be unmoved at his death. And so love of neighbor is in fact incompatible with the stern-minded attitude. Now, it is important for me to make sure you understand that not every influential thinker in the Christian tradition takes the stern-minded attitude. Aquinas is an example of someone who rejects it. So, for example, in explaining why Christ told his disciples that Christ was going to the Father in order to comfort his disciples when they were sad at the prospect of Christ leaving them, Aquinas says this. He says, it's common among friends to be less sad over the absence of a friend when the friend is going to something which exalts him. And that is why the Lord gives his disciples this reason for his leaving, in order to console them. So, unlike Teresa's rejection of grief at the prospect of losing her father, Aquinas is here accepting the appropriateness of a person's grief at the loss of a loved person, and he's validating the need for consolation for such grief. So Aquinas is not to be ranked among the members of the stern-minded group. And actually, neither is Teresa of Avila. In other moods, when she is not self-consciously evaluating her own spiritual progress, Teresa sounds more like Aquinas and less like Cassian. So on the subject of the stern-minded attitude, the Christian tradition is of two minds. Not all its influential figures stand with Cassian, and even among those who do stand with Cassian, many, like Teresa, are double-minded about it. Now here I need to pause and talk with you about a possible confusion you could have. You might think to yourself, isn't it part of Christian doctrine that God allows the death of any person who dies? Does any person die when God wills that that person live? So when a person dies, on Christian theology, isn't it the will of God that that person die? So in what sense could Teresa, or anybody, be united with God in will if she grieves over her father's death? How could she be united with God as she explains she wants to be if her will is frustrated in what God's will commands? Now this position and these questions, in my view, rest on too simple an understanding of God's will and too simple an understanding of union with God. To see why, assume that when Teresa's father dies, he goes to heaven, and in heaven he is united with God. Then the death, which unites Teresa's father permanently with God, has the opposite effect for Teresa from the effect it has for God. At least for now, the death of Teresa's father deprives Teresa of her father's presence and keeps her from union with him. For this reason, on the Christian doctrine Teresa also accepts, love's desire for union with the beloved can't be fulfilled in the same way for Teresa as for God. If Teresa's will is united with God's will in desiring union with her father, then Teresa's will has to be frustrated at the very event, her father's dying, which fulfills God's will with respect to her father. And something analogous can be said about the other desire of love for the good of the beloved. If Teresa desires the good of her father, she can only desire what her own mind sees as good. But her mind's ability to see the good is obviously much smaller than God's. To the extent to which Teresa's will is united with God's will in desiring the good of the beloved, then Teresa will also desire for the beloved person things different from those desired by God, in virtue of Teresa's differing ability to see the good for the beloved person. Now, it's easy to be confused here because this phrase, the good for the beloved person, can be used in two different ways. And I have to give you a little philosophical, technical terminology. The only time I'll do it in the lecture, just a little, to show you the point. So for philosophers, a phrase can be used either attributively or it can be used referentially. That is, that phrase, the good of the beloved, can be used to refer to particular things, some specific particular things essential to the beloved's flourishing, or the phrase, the good of the beloved, can be used opaquely, blindly, to refer to anything under the description, the good. A mother who's baffled by the quarrels among her adult children and who has no idea how to bring about a just peace for those quarreling children, she may say despairingly, I just want the good for everybody. And now she's using the phrase the good attributively with no idea of how to use it referentially. That's a distinction. If Teresa were tranquil over any affliction which happens to her father, because she thinks that in this tranquility her will is united to God's will, and that she's therefore willing the good for her father, the good in this thought of hers is being used in the same way that poor mother used it, attributively, to designate whatever God thinks is good. But that can't be the way the good is used in any thought of God's, unless we think the good is just anything God wills. But if we reject such radical theological relativism, then it isn't the case that anything God desires is good just because God desires it. And so it also isn't true that God desires as the good of the beloved person whatever it is that God desires for her. When God desires the good for someone, he must desire it by desiring particular things as the good for that person. So to say that God desires the good for a person is to use the good referentially. For this reason, when in an effort to will what God wills, Teresa desires whatever happens to her father as the good for her father, she thereby actually fails to will what God wills. To be united with God in willing the good for her father requires willing for her father particular things which are in fact his good. And doing so requires recognizing the particular things which are that good. So think about it this way. At the death of Mao Zedong in China, one of the groups competing for political power was called in a mocking way the whatever faction, because the members of that group were committed to maintaining as true and compulsory for all Chinese to believe anything Mao said, whatever it was. So the other Chinese called them the whatever faction. In trying to desire whatever happens as good because God wills it, a person is, in effect, trying to be a part of a whatever group for God. She's trying to maintain as good anything that happens, whatever it is, on the grounds that that is what God wills. Understanding this subtle but very important difference in attitude between Teresa in that passage I read you and Aquinas in the passage I read you helps to make clear a really peculiar part of the biblical book of Job. In that peculiar part, God rebukes Job's comforters because they did not say of God the thing that was right, unlike God's servant Job, who did. That's what God says. Now, what the comforters had actually said is this. The comforters said, God is justified in allowing Job's suffering. And what Job had said is that his suffering is unjust, and God shouldn't have allowed it to happen. So how is it that in the story, God says Job said what was right, and the comforters didn't? The answer lies in understanding the point I just made about the whatever faction. The answer lies in seeing that the comforters took Job's suffering to be good just because they thought Job's suffering was willed by God. So those comforters were and wanted to be part of a whatever faction of God. But Job was defiant in his refusal to be partisan in this way. And so on the apparently paradoxical view of the book of Job, in opposing God, Job is more allied with God's will than the comforters are. That is why, in the story of Job, when God comes to adjudicate the dispute between Job and the comforters, God sides with Job, who had opposed him, and not with the comforters, who were trying to affirm what God had done. Now, the apparent paradox here can be resolved by Aquinas' distinction between God's antecedent and consequent will. So I'm going to give you a little story to help you understand this distinction. I have a lovely little grandson, very troublesome little guy. And once, when we were all at dinner, and he was eating his favorite food, which is pizza, he hit his sister and threw his food on the floor. And his mother said to him, "Johnny, if you hit your sister one more time and throw your food on the floor one more time, your dinner is over, you're getting no pizza, and you will be in your room by yourself." And he looked at his mother and hit his sister and threw his pizza on the floor. Then his mother picked him up and put him in his room and closed the door, and he screamed bloody murder. And we tried to eat our pizza, listening to him screaming. Now, this is the distinction between the antecedent and the consequent will. Antecedently, what the mother of this little child wanted was that we have a happy dinner and we all eat pizza together. Given what that little Johnny willed, her consequent will was that we eat our pizza in silence, listening to him screaming in his room. So that's the distinction between the antecedent and the consequent will. Whatever happens in the world happens only because it's in accordance with God's will, but that will is God's consequent will. And the consequent will has to be distinguished from God's antecedent will. Many things that happen in the world are not in accordance with God's antecedent will. You can think about it this way: God's antecedent will is what God would have willed if everything in the world had been up to God alone. God's consequent will is what God in fact does will, given what all God's creatures will. God's consequent will is his will for the greatest good available in the circumstances, where the circumstances are generated by human free will. To try to be in accord with God's will by taking as acceptable, as unworthy of sorrow, everything that happens, is to confuse the consequent will of God with the antecedent will of God. It is to try to accept as intrinsically good even those things which God wills as good only in his consequent will, as good in the circumstances. God does not will as intrinsically good everything God wills. What God wills in his consequent will is sometimes only the lesser of two evils, the best available in the circumstances, where the circumstances are made by human free will. And so to try to accept as good whatever happens on the grounds that it's God's will is the wrong way to try to be united with God. One can desire as intrinsically good what one sees for oneself as good, or one can try to desire as intrinsically good whatever happens on the grounds that it's God's will. But only the first of those two desires can be in accordance with God's will, given that God's consequent will isn't the same as his antecedent will. And for the same reasons, only that former desire leads to union with God. So although it appears paradoxical here, as it did in the book of Job, the closest a human person may be able to come in this life to uniting her will with God's will may include her willing things, say that her father not die, which are opposed to God's consequent will. And here it is important also to see in this connection that in principle, there cannot be any competition between the love of God and the love of other persons. You don't love God more if you love other human beings less. On the contrary, if one does not love one's neighbor, then one does not love God either. And that's because to love God is to desire union with God. And union with God requires being united in will with God. But a person who does not love somebody else, her father, for example, cannot be united in will with God because God does love these people. So in being tranquil and unmoved in the face of the death of a beloved father or any person, is not being more united with God, more in harmony with God's will, but less. So for all these reasons, the stern-minded attitude, which accords no value to the desires of the heart, is to be rejected. Whatever the antiquity and the ancestry of this attitude is, such influential figures as Aquinas do not accept it. More importantly, it is a very unattractive position, even from the point of view of an ascetically minded Christianity. The stern-minded attitude underlies that terrible mindset exemplified in Cashin's story about Patermudas, and it is also incompatible with the love of one's neighbor, and therefore, in the end, incompatible with the love of God. There are things worth desiring other than the intrinsically valuable things necessary for human flourishing, and the desires for these things should not be suppressed or stamped out. On the contrary, as Cashin's story makes clear, the attempt to root out the desires of the heart, like a father's desire for his son, the attempt to root out those desires does not lead to human virtue and excellence, as Cashin thought it did. It leads to an inhumanity willing to murder one's own child in the service of a confused and reprehensible attempt at self-denial. And there's another point here which is complicated and on your handout, and I'm going to skip it. We're just going to skip it. We had enough. So what I want to say is, for all these reasons, we can leave the objections of the stern-minded attitude to one side. It remains the case that justification is also needed for God's allowing the suffering that stems from unfulfilled desires or frustrated desires of the heart. And for this reason, theodicies that focus just on flourishing as the morally sufficient reason for God's allowing evil are at best incomplete. Even if we give a theodicy such as John Hick's soul-making theodicy everything it wants as regards the relation between suffering and a person's flourishing, there remains the problem of suffering stemming from the loss of the desires of the heart. So think about Job again. And for the sake of argument, let it be the case, as Aquinas thinks in his excellent and impressive commentary on Job, let it be the case that Job's suffering is necessary for Job's purification and ennobling. Suppose that Job's suffering is also morally acceptable as a means to that glorification of Job. Suppose all those things. Even if this were entirely so, something more would be needed for theodicy in Job's case. Job might care more about his children, the children who died in his suffering. Job might care more about those children than he cares about his own purification, ennobling, and glorification. And he might be heartbroken and stay heartbroken at the loss of his children, even with the benefit of that purification, ennobling, and glorifying. And so something else also needs to be said about the moral justification for God's allowing such heartbreak. Now, somebody might object that if the benefit to Job really is connected to his suffering in such a way as to produce that glorification, then nothing more is needed for theodicy, because the good given to Job through his suffering, that great glorification, defeats the suffering. But that objection really is just the stern-minded attitude all over again. It accords no value to the desires of Job's heart. But as I've been at pains to show you here, disregarding or downplaying the desires of the heart is unreasonable. Suffering is a function of what we care about, and we care not only about our flourishing, we care also about all those things on which we have set our hearts. And that is why the suffering stemming from the loss of the heart's desire also needs to be redeemed. The benefit of flourishing by itself doesn't redeem it and doesn't defeat it. It really helps to see these things, because it helps to explain why so many people feel uneasy or disappointed or angry at attempted solutions to the problem of evil that focus only on some global good for human flourishing, the significant use of free will, soul-making, and so on. If a person's own flourishing isn't sufficient to justify God in allowing her to be heartbroken, then the flourishing of the whole human species can't be considered to do so either. And so the desires of the heart have to be considered in connection with the problem of evil. This is where I'm going to end. So this is just a teaser for the book, you might say. It's a movie trailer for the whole book. What I want to tell you is that I do think it's possible to find a way to develop Aquinas' excellent theodicy in such a way that it gives a satisfactory resolution of the problems posed by the desires of the heart. But all I had time to do in this lecture is show you the problem and not to solve it for you. So I'm done. Thank you.
We do the first question. Dr. Bishar.
I'll say it in Spanish. Entonces, a ver, siguiendo esta línea de razonamiento.
Okay.
Siguiendo esta línea de razonamiento, podríamos decir que, no sé si decir happiness o la felicidad, es ese antecedent will de Dios.
Oh, I should. Okay, wait.
Ah. Entonces, siguiendo esta línea de razonamiento y esta propuesta que usted hace sobre el antecedent will y el consequent will, ¿no? el deseo consecuente de Dios. La felicidad, happiness, podría ser el deseo antecedente de Dios, y el mal o el sufrimiento, el deseo consecuente de Dios como consecuencia de la acción del hombre.
Absolutely. Think about it. Think about it. So, what is the story that Genesis gives us in the beginning? God saw that everything God had made was very good. And in the Garden of Eden, there is no suffering. There isn't even, you'll be astonished to hear this, in Argentina, there isn't even any eating of meat. Even the animals don't suffer. So that is God's antecedent will. And the whole point of the story in Genesis is to tell us the fact that we have the world we do is not because God likes this, is because He's doing the best He can with us given what we did and what we made out of this world. So for sure, it's His antecedent will is not this.
Yo hubiera deseado un Dios más creativo. I would have liked a God, a more creative God.
Yes, but you are thinking that God would be more creative and more powerful if he were a puppet master. If the only will that there were his. But any idiot can make a robot, as MIT in my country shows you. Making something that can spit in your eye and say, I don't like you, only God can do that. Takes more creativity. And if you think about it this way. If what God were going to make in his creativity is just something that his will could entirely control, why would he want to? What fun is there for him in this? If you want in your family to have a child, and the MIT scientists say, oh, don't bother, we'll build you a robot, it will be much better for you. You'll never have to worry about teenage rebellion if you have one of ours. Who wants it? If that's what you want, you don't want a child. More creativity this way, more power also.
Muchas gracias. Quería preguntar relacionado con lo que preguntó Marcelo recién, de la voluntad antecedente y la voluntad consecuente de Dios, que sería una pieza clave para entender esta cuestión. ¿Cómo puede entenderse algo que en Dios parecería un cambio motivado por algo exterior? ¿No? Si justamente el problema de la teodicea es justificar como un Dios absoluto, que es acto puro, se puede relacionar con eso, ¿no? Y relacionado también con lo que le respondía a Marcelo, esta cuestión de que si el argumento central para la distinción entre las dos voluntades es el respeto de Dios por la libertad humana, si cuando algo que hace el hombre es malo y hay una víctima, no se respeta ahí la libertad solo del victimario y no de la víctima.
So there are two questions here. One has to do with divine attributes, and one has to do with the problem of evil. So we'll separate them. So the question about the attributes of God goes like this. On classical theism, which Aquinas accepts, God is immutable. He does not change. He cannot change. So the question asks, if God has an antecedent and a consequent will, doesn't he have to change? He begins with an antecedent will, and then he moves into a consequent will. But see, that question is mistaken. Go back to the story about my little grandson Johnny and the pizza. So the will of his mother doesn't change. She has what you might call a plan that goes like this. If he behaves, we eat together. If he doesn't behave, we don't. That's the plan she has, and she puts into practice whichever part of this plan she needs given what he does. But she doesn't change her mind, see? And that's how it is with God. God wills differences, but he doesn't have different wills when he does. So that's how we handle that one. Now, I like all these questions. You should know. I think these are wonderful questions, and I especially like your second question. So the second question is this. Suppose, well, here, go back to the biblical stories. Take a look at the story of Cain and Abel. You can see the question very nicely in the story of Cain and Abel. So we start out with the story of Cain and Abel like this. They each bring an offering to God. God accepts Abel's, he rejects Cain's. And then Cain gets very angry. At that point, God comes to talk to Cain. And he says to Cain, look, you're getting angry. Watch yourself. Be careful. You keep this up, you're going to be in real trouble. Well, and then Cain kills Abel. And when Cain is done killing Abel, God comes back to talk to him and says, hey, where's your brother? Cain says, I don't know. And God says, yeah, I know why you don't know. And here's your punishment. you're going to be cast out of my presence, I'm going to work a miracle, you can't farm anymore, and so on. Now you take a look at what God did for Cain. Count it up. He talked to him, he warned him, he sent him away from his place, he worked a miracle on his behalf, and notice that any one of these things, any one of them would have saved Abel. There's your question. If he's willing to talk to Cain and tell him, give him a warning, why Cain, the jerk? Why not talk to Abel and say to Abel, hey, I've got a warning for you. I'm going to send you away. I'm going to work a miracle for you and protect you from your angry brother Cain. Nothing for Abel, all for Cain. The very first story in the Bible after the fall sets the pattern for everything that comes later. Now that's to help you with your question. See, I haven't answered it. I've just made it really powerful. So how are we supposed to understand this question? Well, think about it like this. The story says that Abel is righteous. Cain is guilty. Okay. Who has need of God's care here? It is part of the Christian story that at death, you go into the afterlife, not into the nothing, into the afterlife. And whether you go to be united with the God you love or into permanent absence from God is a function of your condition when you die. Abel, in dying, is not harmed by Cain. But Cain, who kills him prematurely, has harmed himself in killing his brother. And so God uses all his wisdom, all his power, to bring Cain into some kind of condition which is not lethal for Cain, because the one in real danger of dying is not Abel, it's Cain. And that's the general principle on which we would sort out your questions.
Buenas tardes. Quisiera preguntarle si la explicación del problema del mal está de alguna manera en el modo en que Dios creó al hombre como un ser libre. ¿Cómo podría explicarse también el problema del mal, no solo que produce el hombre, sino el que sufre, por ejemplo, la naturaleza, que no es fruto del mal del hombre?
So this is a question which comes from, I would say, an older layer in the philosophical discussion of the problem of evil. At that point, we used to divide evil in the world into moral evil and natural evil. And then we used to ask, how is it that God could allow moral evil or natural evil? Do we have to give two different explanations? But I don't think this is at all useful, and mostly we have abandoned it now in the discussion, and here's why. Because natural evil, that is evil like diseases or earthquakes or tornadoes and so on, these raise no problem unless human beings suffer from them or other intelligent creatures suffer from them. It's the suffering of human beings that makes the problem for religious belief. It's not the mere fact of tornadoes and earthquakes and so on. And moral evil is confusingly ambiguous as between moral wrongdoing, on the one hand, and suffering generated by human moral wrongdoing, on the other hand. Basically, the entire problem that is raised for religious belief is a problem of suffering. The question is why God allows human beings to suffer. And it doesn't really matter whether he allows their suffering to come from an earthquake or from you. Either way, what we care about is that he allowed somebody to suffer when he could have prevented it. And so that's the task of theodicy, to try to show why God would allow suffering. That's the job. And doesn't matter what its origin is, just that he allowed it.
If we also accept that God is omniscient, then we have to think that God predicted evil in a way. Because he had to know that human beings, we tend to evil in a way.
Keep going. What's the question?
Keep going with the question.
Yeah, keep going. What is the question?
The question is if God predicted evil.
But what's your question? Are you saying, look, if he knew there was going to be evil, he shouldn't have created?
No, I'm not saying that he shouldn't. I'm not arguing, because I also accept that God is omniscient. So
Yeah.
if he did accept it evil, it must be for a good reason. I'm not questioning that. What I'm asking is if I have to assume that God predicted evil.
Ah, okay, okay. Okay, so here's the question. If God's omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good and so on, doesn't God know in advance that human beings are going to do evil? And the answer is no. No, because God is not in time. Time is part of God's creation. They're conspiring over there. It's hard to answer that question. So we will ask him what he's talking about in just a minute, but I will answer her question first. Yeah. So God is not in time. God is eternal. Now, eternity is a very difficult divine attribute to understand. And it's often confused just with timelessness, but it isn't just timelessness. So I can show you how to think about the relation between an eternal God and things in time. So imagine a little two-dimensional world. This is it. This is it. Oops, turn it off. Okay. This is the little two-dimensional world, and it's bounded just like this, and there are intelligent two-dimensional creatures who live in it, and right in the middle of it, in the absolute middle of it, is a little intelligent square called Max. And suppose now that we can talk to Max and we say, "Hi, Max," and he says, "Well, wait, where are you?" And we say to him, "We're here." He says, "No, you're not. I'm here, and it's metaphysically impossible for anything to be here except me when I'm here. So you're not here." And suppose we say, "Well, Max, actually, you're right in front of me." And Max will say, "No. Right in front of me is Peter. I can see him clear as can be, and you're not Peter." So now we're going to have trouble explaining this to Max, and we're going to say, "Well, Max, here's the thing. Our world is metaphysically bigger than your world. So actually, your whole world is here for us." And Max will say, "Are you telling me that I'm deluded in thinking I'm here?" We say, "No. No, Max, you're right. In your world, you're here and nothing else is here. But your world is one thing, our world is another thing. There's one kind of here in your world and another kind of here in ours. And our here is so big, your whole world fits into our here." Now we have the doctrine of eternity. There's now in time, which is a cut in the continuum, ever-changing. And then there's now for God, which is stretched out, never falls apart into past and future, and is metaphysically so much greater than now time that all of time fits into God's now, in the way that all of Max's world fits into our here. So God does not know anything in advance. He does not plan anything in advance. He does not foreknow the future. He does not remember the past, because all of time is encompassed within his now. And he knows the things that are future with respect to you, because he sees them as they happen, just as I see you now. That's why.
Cuando leí la historia de Patermutus, el ejemplo que puso del monje que estaba dispuesto a asesinar a su propio hijo, inmediatamente me parece que a todos nos viene a la conciencia la imagen de Abraham. Entonces, ¿cuál sería? Pues lo difícil es condensar una respuesta en poco. Pero ¿cuál sería la diferencia de actitud de Abraham frente a Dios y la de Patermutus frente a la ridícula imposición de su
Well, as some of you are going to know, I have answered this question in a big fat part of my book. But here's something like the short answer. Kierkegaard has made all of us think of the story of Abraham and the offering of Isaac in a particular way. And I appreciate Kierkegaard. I honor Kierkegaard. I think he's a great, deep thinker, but he's just wrong about the story of Abraham. That's it. He's just wrong about it. So the way Kierkegaard reads it, it does look like the story of Paternoster. Somehow Abraham believes or hears God tells him that sacrificing his son is necessary for love of God, and he's willing to do it. But that is actually to read the story of the sacrifice of Isaac completely out of context of the whole story. And as any married person will tell you, if you take an episode in the life of a human person totally out of context, you're going to get the wrong idea of what happened. So the thing to understand is that from the beginning of the story of Abraham in the Bible to the end, Abraham is presented as a person who has one great heart's desire to have a family, a tribe, a people, and he's got nothing, no child at all. God uses this great desire on Abraham's part to build a relationship with Abraham, to see if he can get Abraham to trust him, to come close to him. So what God does is promise Abraham what he wants in a series of promises which become ever more explicit as Abraham comes closer to God. So the first promise is just that Abraham will have a child, an heir. But Abraham doesn't know if it's a biological child, an adopted child, a child from his wife Sarah, or for somebody else. Bit by bit, the promises become disambiguated, but Abraham's got to wait for God and trust. So at a certain point, Abraham's got this much promise: you will have a child who is your biological child. At every point where God makes the promises, nothing happens. Nothing happens. And when God promises Abraham he'll have a biological child, Abraham gets sick and tired of waiting, and he goes to have sex with the servant girl. If Sarah can't give him this biological child, there's a handy female, she can do it. That actually wasn't what God had in mind. And nonetheless, it does produce a child, and then we've got this kid, Ishmael. He's not part of God's promise. He's not part of the story. And at a certain point, God explains it to Abraham, look, the child of the promise comes through Sarah. It won't be Ishmael. And at that point, Ishmael becomes superfluous, in the way. We don't need him anymore. He's wrecking the story. Abraham didn't just want a baby. He wanted a people. He wanted to be a patriarch of a people. And now he's got this kid who's going to make a mess out of being patriarch of a people because he's not part of the promise. So Abraham has a problem in Ishmael. And he's got an even bigger problem in Sarah, because the minute Sarah's got a kid of her own, all she can think is get rid of that other woman and her child. Who wants her? Who needs her? And at that point, Abraham, who is basically a decent human being, is really troubled. He'd like to get rid of that kid, and he'd like to make his wife stop being mad, but this is still his son. So he's troubled. And God comes to him and he says, go ahead, do what Sarah wants, get rid of the kid and his mother. And then, think about the story of Abraham. What does he do? In other cases where there's things he wants, he bargains with God. Remember that? He bargains. He gathers an army to protect the people he loves. Remember that? He does that. Abraham does a lot of stuff when what he cares about is at stake. in this case of his son, when God says, go ahead, Abraham doesn't bargain with him. Abraham doesn't ask him any questions. Abraham doesn't say, well, I'll tell you what, we'll get an army to send him to a good place and keep him safe. Abraham hands that woman and her child a bottle of water and a loaf of bread and sends them into the desert by themselves. Now, you know, if you were God, how would you feel about Abraham? Looks a little sleazy, doesn't it? What protects Abraham from actually being a villain is that Abraham can say to God, God says to Abraham, don't worry, I promise I'll take care of Ishmael and he'll become a great people. So Abraham can say to himself and to Ishmael and to God, I'm not worried about this because God is going to take care of you. Now what we would like to know and what God would like to know is, did Abraham mean that? Or did he say it because it got him off the hook? How are we going to know if Abraham meant that or not? Well, here's a test case for you. God said Isaac would be the son of the promise and would grow up to be himself the ancestor of a people. So when Abraham and his son Isaac, when Isaac is still a teenager, if Isaac dies then without children, God's promise will be a lying, false promise. So now we want to know if Abraham believes God's promise or not. Here's how you can do it. You tell Abraham, when Isaac is still a teenager, tell him, sacrifice this kid to me. You believe my promises? You think I'm good? Let's see if you do. And here's how you can tell that this is the right way to understand this story, because this is how Abraham himself understood it. In the story, it's how Abraham understands it. When God says to him, take your son and sacrifice him to me, Abraham says nothing. Not a word. He has nothing he can say. He knows it's God, and he knows he has it coming. And so Abraham goes off to sacrifice this child in what the story says is a test of Abraham. But it's a test not to see if Abraham will give God anything whatsoever and violate all moral standards in doing it. It's a test to see whether Abraham believes in God's goodness. And Abraham passes that test only if Abraham believes that in taking his son to sacrifice him, he's not killing the child. And that is how you can understand what Abraham says to the servants when they leave the servants and go off to the top of the mountain. Abraham says to the servants, you stay here, and the boy and I will be back pretty soon. If you don't read the story the way I do, what you have to say is Abraham was lying. Right at the point of his son's death, he was lying to his son and lying to the servants, and that's more bad than most of us are willing to attribute to Father Abraham. So that's how I would see it.
No podríamos pensar, considerando que el mal en el fondo en muchos casos permite recuperación, el caso de la adicción de drogas. No podríamos pensar que si el mal permite recuperación y de alguna manera crecimiento, después de todo hay algo de bueno en el sufrimiento. Y si hay algo de bueno en el sufrimiento, no podríamos pensar que es una creación divina. Y si es una creación divina, no podríamos pensar después de todo que no es un Dios tan bueno.
Well, I'm surprised at the way you ended that question because the ending doesn't fit. I was going to praise you for having a deep and powerful question, and you wrecked it all right at the end. So here's how I see. I'll take your question as I thought you were asking it, and then I'll take it as you did ask it. So I thought you were saying, look, if evil and suffering can be overcome, they can produce good for the sufferer, then maybe it's part of God's plan that there be suffering. And if it's part of God's plan that there be suffering, maybe we should never try to alleviate suffering. That's where I thought you were going. Well, that's a good question. That's a good question. That actually is a good question. It's a powerful question for any theodicy. But if you want to say then maybe God wouldn't be good, I mean, on your own way of laying out the question, that question has a ready answer. If suffering is good for you, it's something important for your being flourishing or glorious or something, well then of course there's nothing bad in God allowing you to grow and flourish. I mean, you know, think about a mother who wanted to make sure that there never was any suffering for her children ever at all. I mean, what would we think about her? Would we think she was good? I don't think so. Because what we all know is that through the suffering, the child can grow. So I once looked out my window and saw my precious, beautiful, blonde-haired firstborn son standing in the lawn in front of my house, little tiny guy, and a bigger boy had a plastic baseball bat, and he was going thump, thump, thump on the head of my son. And my first thought was, I know what I'll do, I'll kill the big boy. But my second thought was, no, I'm not going to do anything, I'm just going to watch. Because I thought my son has to learn to fight his own battles. He has to show the neighborhood boys that he's strong and able to defend himself. And unless he has these things in his life is not going to go well with the neighborhood boys. So I just stood there and watched it. Not because I wasn't loving, but precisely because I was. So the question as you asked it does not seem to me hard to answer.
Bueno, nada más. Sencillamente agradecer mucho la presentación y la colaboración con nosotros. Y siempre los todos por participar.
Thank you.